Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Implementing ARCHIBUS as a Space Management Solution for Large Healthcare and University Organizations. With us is Bob Stephen, and he's the CEO of Professional Services, RSC. Bob's originally from San Francisco. He's been with ARCHIBUS for 22 years, 19 years as his own business, and prior to that, 13 years as a landscape architect. And in this session, we'll review lessons from the ARCHIBUS implementation journey at a large healthcare organization, include key strategies for implementing a successful IWMS solution and the common complexities that should be considered. We'll also discuss shared chargeback with an affiliated university. And here's Bob.
Thank you, David. Show of hands, ARCHIBUS users? Couple, okay. Non-ARCHIBUS users? Okay, and you're here because? Oh, no, it's you have to, you're GIS guys, right? All right, very good. So I have 45 slides in 45 minutes, and I have a tendency to speak very quickly, so if you need me to slow down, throw something at me and I will slow down. Here's the agenda for today. I'm going to hit 3 topics, basically some key strategies for implementing an IWMS system, which it really doesn't matter whether it's Plan-On or ARCHIBUS or FM systems. These principles work across all IWMS systems. We're going to talk about the complexities that were considered with this healthcare. I cannot use their name. They asked me not to use their name, but you can imagine it's in Northern California in an Ivy League school. Which one is that? And then we're going to talk about some of the cool things we did there. So to start off with, just to let you know who I am, Bob Stephen, the CEO of RSC. I've been married for 30 some odd years. I'm a lecturer for 25. I've lectured at AIA in San Francisco and in Honolulu and Chicago on passing licensing exams for architects. And I've got an echo. Sorry. That's okay, not a problem. I have 3 books that are published, and one of my loves is coaching rugby. I coach a high school rugby team, girls rugby, high school. Very proud of the fact we took 6th in the country this year, and I have 3 of my 9 graduates have full ride scholarships to colleges. We've been as high as 3rd in the country, and I never played 1 minute of rugby, but I'm coaching it, but I love it. All right, I'm going to talk a lot about this diagram. If there's anything you take away, it's this diagram here. I know this is a technology conference, and we're all looking at technology, and technology is overwhelming us. But in my experience, you need to understand that there are 2 greater elements to making decisions and implementing a technology. That is the business process and the relationship arena or the political environment. What I mean by this pie chart is if I was to take a month of my time and tell you what I do, 80% of my time is spent in the political arena and in the business process arena, not necessarily implementing technology. Does that make sense? Those meetings as consultants. And so when you go out to RFP, a lot of them are, is it easy to use? Can you do reports? Well, yeah, we all do that. You should be talking about, can you meet this business process? We'll be talking about that a little bit. So I'm going to give you about 7 of the 10 top things that I do. I'm not going to provide all of them just because I don't have enough time. These are some of the key strategies. You need to identify an internal champion, define your successor vision, develop processes and procedures, who owns what are the standards that you want to follow, understanding your IT environment, navigating through politics, and automation. So let's talk about the first one, which is identifying the champion. You may call it someone else a business analyst, although business analyst may be from an IT department or from a business strategy department. I consider a champion someone who has an overarching view of multiple cost centers and can guide you through the implementation. Their number one job is to protect the entity and its installation. So for example, because I'm an ARCHIBUS business partner, I'm going to want to sell you key management and energy management and everything I can. Well, if that's not in your vision, if that's not in the process that's going to be most beneficial for your organization, the business, internal champion is the individual who should be pushing back on the business partner and saying, yeah, not this year, not part of the strategy, not part of the 3 to 5 or 10-year plan. And conversely, if there are technologies that the business partner brings, the internal champion should then be bringing it to the entity and go, you know, this is something I think we ought to consider. I think there's benefit here, not only economically, but maybe process-wise. One of the main roles is the mediator between cost centers. And I call this a translator. Oftentimes when IT comes to us, and you give them a problem, and if they don't want to do it, they'll give you a couple sentences that you don't fully understand, right? Acronyms, the newest technology, because they're trying to protect their world. And that's totally fine. I understand it. They've got a process that they've got to keep in place. Internal champion should be able to translate between the needs of the corporate real estate department, facilities department, the GIS department, and the IT department, and or HR, and or finance. If you share data, which all of us are sharing data these days, that internal champion is a huge translator. Let's go to the next one. What is your vision? I like to eat an elephant one bite at a time. Some companies like to eat the whole elephant. We'll have an RFP that goes out, or they'll have a request to go out to do, I want these 15 modules installed in 9 months. There's nothing really wrong with that, but you need to have a clear vision and clear understanding of how that goes. I like to start small. I like to start small with small successes, and once that success rolls, then that builds. But some of the questions you should ask is, how much do I need? What am I really trying to solve? Are we growing? Are there future plans? Is this a siloed application? Is it just space management? Or is it an enterprise application, which includes preventive maintenance and housekeeping and asset tracking and energy management and lease and churn rate and chargeback and project management, capital budgeting? Is it all that? So the success and vision. And again, bigger is not always better. Sometimes it is. So the success and the vision needs to be very clear and laid out. Processes. Does your work order system require 1 step, 3 steps, 5 steps, 8 steps? It's going to take a little work on your part to determine what that process is. But having that process well defined is one of the key elements to having a successful implementation. For example, I have an internet auction company in Campbell, California that has a 9-step on-demand work order system, right? They've defined it. I have another entertainment company in the Monterey area that has a 3-step on-demand work order process. Neither one of them is right, neither one of them is wrong. It works for their company. If software can't go 3 or can't go 9 or can't go 15, you need to look at that. Make sure that you know what your business process is, and the software can actually hit your process. So let me give you an example of that. This internet company doesn't have a help desk. In other words, it's all self-served on the internet. So their process is that a person will input the work order system online. It'll then automatically be routed through workflow rules to the proper work team. The supervisor will then identify which craftsperson is on staff at that point in time and should be assigned to, assigns it to that craftsperson. The craftsperson then gets the tools and the parts, does the job, closes the ticket out, surveys are sent back out, and end user is identified and notified that the work has been completed and asked for a satisfaction survey. The 3-step process is basically submits a work request, automatically goes to the craftsperson fixes it, and it completes it. It's perfectly acceptable. But you need to understand what your process is and be able to define that as you implement your system. Questions? Thoughts? Okay. Ownership. This is probably one of the, again, it's one of the top 3 or 4 things that I recommend, and that's ownership. So IWMS systems typically don't own everything. They should house a lot of things, but they don't own it. Let me give you an example. In today's world, we should not have to fat key, what I mean by that is type or write, anything more than once. So if Bob Stevens joins one of your universities, HR hires me. And they probably put me in after the procurement thing is, and that should be the only time my name is typed inside that company. Because that should synchronize to the IWMS system, the GIS system, the IT systems, the asset tracking systems, right? And as long as you understand ownership, that'll flow really, really well. Here's where it falls apart. Let me give you an example. If you have employees on staff, those are usually W-2 employees, and they're usually kept in an employee database like Workday. Workday's now come forward with some very wonderful things of also identifying vendors or professional services individuals. But many times they don't. And so if you may have anywhere from 2 to 20% of your staff that are not employees. They're not W-2'd. And if they don't come through on your HR system, you've got another system coming through bringing information in. So I had a hospital in San Jose that I had to synchronize with 9 systems to identify every employee in that hospital. Yeah, I mean, just think about it. Some of the doctors don't work for the county. They're independent, private, yet they use the hospital to perform surgeries. And they had to have badging, and so they were in the badge system. Some of them had pagers. They were in the pager system. They weren't getting paid by the county, so we weren't getting synchronization from the county. It goes on and on. Volunteers, candy stripers, all these different databases we had to synchronize to get the full set. And it's doable, but you need to understand who owns what. And because they had 9 systems, it took a lot of verification of duplicates. I would oftentimes get 4 or 5 records of the same person that had to match. And the challenges with that is my mom named me Robert. I go by Bob. Some people call me Bobby, right? And in some systems, if they're different, it's hard to say, hey, is Bobby Stevens still the same thing as Bob Steven, right? So identifying ownership is key. So HR owns people. Finance owns org, right? Cost center division department. IT owns assets and email addresses and IP addresses and logins. Real estate owns buildings and leases, and facilities owns operations, moves, maintenances. And so if you understand that, you can synchronize the data, which leads me to my next point, which is extremely important, and that is standards. How do you name things? So if HR owns people, how that record is distributed to other systems should be owned by HR. Conversely, if facilities owns buildings, how you name the building and distribute it to other systems should be owned by facilities, right? Many times I've had implementations where I had 4 building names because that department named, it's called Building A. Wait a minute, that's the John F. Kennedy building. No, wait a minute, that's the new student center, right? In my database, student center, John F. Kennedy, And so standards from ownership is very, very important, especially when you start to report. And one of my recommendations on reporting, or on these systems, especially on IWMS systems, if it doesn't report, it's just an expensive process tool. Because you got to have reports to be able to determine return on investment or savings on investment, right? So again, if the IWMS system doesn't report, it's an expensive business process tool. When a recession comes, when it gets tight for money, you're going to be questioned, how come you're spending so much money on the system? Can you prove its worth? And reports are key. So standards and ownership are necessary. Questions? Agree, disagree? All right. Also unifies the company when it comes to understanding what's what and be able to transfer data. All right, partnering with IT is really, really important. They have, with all the technology and as fast as it's moving, their VP has a process and a plan. They know what they can support, what they're going to support, what they're going to send to training, who they're going to send to training, what they're going to train on. And so oftentimes if you select a system that doesn't meet the IT's requirements, they're going to say you're rogue and outside the system, which isn't necessarily bad, but it needs to be identified by that. Let me give you an example. When I went into Netscape, I brought in my application on my Windows device and was promptly told, go back in 2 weeks and don't ever show me a Microsoft product again, right? We don't do Microsoft here, right? And so knowing IT helps you understand how to select and how to implement your systems. Make sense? Questions on this? Okay. Also, is it a software as a service? Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? What's your preference? Why? Why not? I have theories on the cloud. I think it's wonderful. There's a lot of wonderful things that are going in the cloud, but I'm going to show my age. How many know what a VAX machine is? Anybody work on a VAX machine? Anybody? You worked on a VAX machine? Yeah? So that was kind of a centralized cloud. If you really think about it, everything went to this big, gigantic computer, right? And then all of a sudden the personal computer came out, and now we've all got personal computers, and now guess what? We're now going back out to this unified, give it 15 years, we may slide back around to personal computers. Just my theory. Tier support. Let's talk about tier support. So sometimes these systems are tier 3. In other words, it's important for your cost center, but not necessarily important for the running of the company. Tier 3. We'll support it. We'll make sure it's backed up, and if the computer goes down, the server goes down, we'll start it back up again, but we're not going to put any resources into keeping the system going because it's tier 3. It's your department. Tier 2, somewhat important to our business processes, and we're going to keep it backed up, and we need to understand what technologies you're using, and we need to understand what it's synchronizing with and what support we're going to give there, and can we write the code against it, and we're going to let you touch it. Or tier 1, you can't, the vendor can't touch it at all. It's 100% inside. It's important to us. It's clear if it goes down, you've got 4 hours to get it back up. You better have a redundant system somewhere because it's mission critical, tier 1. So you need to understand what tier your system is. Synchronizations are huge. It's talked about in almost every session at this conference. You should be synchronizing to HR or to your student registration. You should be synchronizing to IT. You should be synchronizing to GIS and to whatever. And you can do as many. I have one client, social media company in Menlo Park, that has 37 synchronizations. We synchronize to Ergo, we synchronize to delivery, we synchronize to catering, we synchronize to HR, we synchronize to 37 systems. Totally acceptable. Again, knowing ownership and standards allows that company to be able to provide some wonderful metrics for strategic decisions, right? Okay. One of the most important things with working with IT or any other departments is sometimes what's in it for them. And so besides just saying, look, I need the system for me, what are you going to get out of it? And oftentimes you can say, look, I can help you understand where your assets are, right? I know where your servers are. I know where your laptops are. I know because we track these in our systems, right? I know where your faceplates are. I know where your cabling is because we can show it geographically either in a GIS system or an IWMS system. So you might be able to hand some information back. HR is big on that. So for example, a lot of our Workday synchronizations will give us the employees, but sometimes we give back location, and that seems a little bit odd because they should know location when you hire them. But a lot of people get hired and start here, and then 2 months later they're there. And HR is really about your paycheck location, not necessarily about where you're working. And so oftentimes Workday now is accepting the actual work location back as a separate location in the HR system. And the reason why that's important is during an emergency, they know where those people are working and can, if the building that houses the IWMS system has an emergency for some reason and you can't access that data, then your Workday or your HR system is a backup and knows the location of these individuals and can help. We were part of the County San Bernardino shooting about 2.5 years ago. We had an ARCHIBUS installation there. And the emergency responders said that we were one of the most critical applications because we knew who was in every building and what the building looked like and how to get in and out. And those were available within minutes. So you can offer that back to IT. Relationships. I call this the political arena. Let's just be real. Sometimes departments don't get along with other departments. Sometimes they get along great. And sometimes it's just personalities. Like you were my roommate in college and we got along or we didn't get along, right? And so be aware of this. And this is where the internal champion should shine. Should there be some issues, he should be the one that's able to smooth that over. And sometimes you can bring the consultant in to kind of work as a translator to kind of help the communications between two disparate departments kind of work it out. Like, what's in it for HR? What's in it for corporate real estate? Why? And again, this is where the internal champion shines. Again, I went through this and said, that 40% of this is the political arena and 40% of this is business process. Only 20% of it's technology. In fact, the reality of it is I can get ARCHIBUS up and running in about an hour and a half with all the data in it. The reason why it takes anywhere from 2 to 9 months is because we have to interact with people who have opinions about how standards go. And they have opinions about ownership of data. And they have opinions about reports. That's all good, right? The reality of it is technology is easy to stand up and get it running. The business process and the political relationship takes it a little bit longer. Let me get a sanity check on me. I got 25 more minutes, is that correct? Okay. So automation. I am big on automation as the last thing you should do. Almost every client that has me automate out of the box sometimes gets down the road about a year later and doesn't understand why certain things are doing what they're doing. It's because they didn't live the business process. They didn't live the process that we automated, right? They did not fully understand what was happening. I'll give you a perfect example. We did a new hire process for a social media company, and we had emails fly on almost every time the person was signed the procurement. An email flew to the hiring manager and to the space captain. When the space captain assigned a seat, emails flew. When IT hooked up the desk, emails flew, right? That lasted for about a week and a half because everybody went and said, I know, that's all, right? That's long, right? Yeah, a week and a half's long. Because there was too many emails. We're always inundated with emails. It felt good on paper to say we need an email notification on every single process. The reality of it is you don't want an email notification on every single process, right? And so sometimes I like to have automation be the very, very last thing that we do, okay, and live it. One of the misnomers on IWMS is that it should read my mind. Like, look, I just bought the system. Shouldn't it just work? Well, no, you have to feed it. It's not Microsoft Word, right? It isn't just a stand-up application. And the other one is, will it do my job for me? Well, sometimes it will. I mean, part of what we're trying to do is do savings on investment, where we reduce the amount of human interface or speed, things like that. So yes, it should make my job easier, but will it take my job from me? No, it won't do your job. People still have to, you still have to say, this is the size of the building, this is the size of the room. Somebody has to AutoCAD it, somebody has to GIS it, somebody has to coordinate it to the world. There are inputs that have to be interfaced. It will not read your mind. You have to work. Do you want me to stand a certain way?
No, you're good. Just keep going.
All right. So I gave you the example of the social media company that went and automated everything. All right. So now we're going to get into some of the challenges at this institution. Some of the challenges we had was basically meeting the reporting requirements for the regulatory for finances. The hospital needed to track beds, how often it was used, utilization of those beds, and so we helped out with those reportings for the regulations. Chargeback mechanisms, which departments or cost centers were in what rooms and for how much square footage and why, and that size. Space categorization, is this a lab, is this an office, is it a cafe, is it a restroom, men's restroom, is it a gender neutral? And then also establishing a partnership between the university and the medical center. So interestingly enough, and I've heard a couple people here, this university's medical center had a separate system from the university system, which had a separate system from the housing system, from the housing departments. And I found that very fascinating. So they had 3 IWMS systems on the same university campus. And I've heard that same story. Anybody else live that? Anybody else, live that? Not sure why, but it's real. So reporting, one of the biggest challenges with reporting. So we basically first start off with occupancy and vacancy. Basically, who's assigned to what room. Now, I consider occupancy and vacancy slightly different from utilization and realization. And let me give you the occupancy and vacancy. If you were to go to the hotel and say, do you have a vacancy? They're going to look to see which rooms don't have a person assigned to the room. Well, I'm not in my room, but it's assigned to me, right? It's occupied. My hotel room is occupied even though I'm standing here. Got it? Vacancy means no one's assigned to that space. That's occupancy, vacancy. Utilization and realization is, how often is Bob in that room? I sleep 6 hours, maybe 8, right? And that's how long I'm in the room. So if you're trying to look for realization or utilization, how much is being used, and then realization, how much got to get out of it, the reality of it is in a hotel room, you could probably get 3 times of it if you could stagger people in and out of the room. You can't, but if you could get more out of it. But that's the concept around space, right? In other words, we did a survey with a utility company in Northern California where they were 87% occupied. In other words, 87% of all the spaces had assigned individuals. But then they did a study at 10 a.m., noon, 2 p.m., 4, and at any given time, the highest they ever got was about a 63% utilization rate. 63%. 47% of it wasn't being used. Why? They're in a conference room, or they're in a meeting, or they're on a sales call, or they're working from home, even though they have a space assigned to them. How do we solve that? We're trying. There's a lot of shared space that's been up and down on that. I don't have an opinion on it. It's very interesting how it goes back and forth. So these are just some of the reports we did. So on one of our hospitals, we used a BOMA A method. Does anybody know that BOMA? Does anybody measure a BOMA? You a little bit? Okay. So what's interesting, a couple of my medical centers don't do BOMA. They just go to the face of the wall. BOMA asks you to go to the center of the wall, right? So in this hospital, we're going to the center of the wall and doing a BOMA A method. And slightly different than a BOMA B. Basically, how do you take the common space and prorate it back according to whether you lease or not lease? And here's some of the reports that we brought forward for them. So the other challenge was chargeback. And I'm very passionate about chargeback. And I'm going to give you bunches of stories about chargeback. And I want you to really kind of think about this. And so about 20 years ago when I was consulting with Silicon Graphics, does anybody remember Silicon Graphics? Does anybody know who Silicon Graphics is? Did anybody know that at one point in time, Silicon Graphics was probably considered, the Google of the day, right? They were the ones that had the animation machines, the O2s, and all those wonderful fast graphic processing machines before Apple came out with their wonderful personal computers that kind of killed SGI. But at one point in time, SGI had something like 28,000 employees in Silicon Valley in the world. So I was with Silicon Valley, and we've been doing chargeback there, which is basically spaces that are dedicated to a division or department are given that division department and its square footage, and they're burdened by all the common space, the hallways, the restrooms, the cafes. Cafes is prorated by site, the hallways are prorated by building, the restrooms are prorated by floor, depending on how that all breaks down. And so Michael Hirahar, the VP, one day after we've been doing it for 3 or 4 years, comes up to me and says, "Bob, how does ARCHIBUS calculate chargeback?" And I go, "This way." And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "Well, because you want to know this 64 square foot cubicle is actually 270 square feet because they get part of the cafe and the da-da-da-da-da." And he goes, "Why?" And he goes, "Well, so that you can actually have equitable chargebacks for every cost center across the, And he goes, "Why?" And I go, "All right, Mike, what are you getting to?" And this, I love this, and I can't get anybody to do this. He looked at me and he said, "Look, we're doing chargeback to charge each department their amount of money that we spend keeping these facilities running, right?" "Yeah, that's right." "Why don't we just take the dedicated space and give them the percentage of the dedicated space by the amount of money we spend?" Brilliant. That's what we started doing at SGI. I haven't been able to get any other company to understand that. We go through tough calculations, BOMA A, BOMA B calculations of, let me burden you with a hallway, let me burden you with, and we're doing that here with this healthcare as well. And what complicates that is when an entity will have a multiple story building, and they'll take the first floor and rent it out to a restaurant or a bank or a a fitness place. And so they own the building, and while they're burdening the rest of the building by charging back all the divisions apart within themselves, they're now wanting to capture what space is leased. And so now we figure that out as well for them. And it's a complicated little calculation, but when you're all done, you find out how much lease space you have, how much income you're getting from this first and second floor you're leasing out. And so that's what we solved here for this client. Questions on chargeback? So one of the big things that I am very, very big on, if there's any takeaway on chargeback that you get, is that I do what's called a double ledger system, okay? Now notice we're out by about 4,000 square feet here. So my double ledger system says that the sum of all the rooms should equal the chargeback, right? Because the chargeback is only to the cost centers that are assigned to rooms and their burden of the common space. So technically, if you take an algebraic equation, they need to equal, and I call it a double ledger. Questions on a double ledger? But right now, this is telling an individual, you better go find out where your 3,700 square feet are off. And you can start here, right? So for example, that's a little off, that's a little off. These actually may not be wrong, but one of these is an anomaly. Like, why are all these floors very similar square footage, and yet this one has less chargeable square footage? I'll bet you that's where your problem is, right? Because those floors look the same. Does it make sense? And one of them has less square footage. Or it's the other three have more square footage. Does it make sense? Double ledger, questions? Okay. We can also take, in many of our universities, we do percentage of space. So in other words, if I have an office that has 3 cost centers in it, I can go 33, 33, and 34. Or I can go 50 and 50, or I can go 50, 25, 25, and charge back that way. And then, yes, sure.
This screen here, is this in a module, or is this
Yeah, this is ARCHIBUS. It's straight out of the
standard? It's not like a
standard. Yeah, it's standard. They have a room percentages table that allows you to take a room, split it in half, and calculate it up. And this is the interface out of Web Central, ARCHIBUS Web Central. All the systems do it. I'm sure that Plan-On does it. I'm sure that FM Systems does it. I'm sure that Tri-Riga and Manhattan Centerstone all do it. Any other questions? And then ultimately, you want to be able to present it on a floor plan, show people where your cost centers are, what the square footages are, and how that rolls up. This is the beginning of showing you that these applications, and in this case, this was a large deal for this client, was to be able to grab, you're going to watch here on the next screen, we're going to grab these 8 rooms right here. And so, see, we grab those 8 right there, and it brings up those 8 here and tells you what division and department are in them, right? And they can go ahead and modify them right here from this screen. And so being able to do multiple edits is one of the other things that we were able to solve. Room spaces and categories, and even though I don't have the room space and category here, the room use kind of defines it. What's a dining room, a trash room, offices, dish room, refrigerators, pantries, all this kind of stuff. And what that ultimately ends up to look like is, what are your room categories and types, and how do they break down? This really helps with strategic planning, and also sometimes life safety. So for example, can't see it so much in this plan, but oftentimes we will take the corridors that are ingress to egress, in other words, those areas that are required by fire marshal to not have a person or thing in it. The other areas can be secondary circulation. In other words, in between the cubicles, you can actually break those down and restack that another way. But there's a certain amount of ingress and egress on the floor that's required by law to be able to get out of a building in an emergency. And so oftentimes we'll use the room category and type to show those things. And then this gives you, total square footages of these types highlighted by, so for example, we've got support facilities at 3,104.6 square feet. Partnership. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but sometimes between departments it looks like this, right? Like, we're not getting along. It's going to be hard to get this off the ground. What do you mean I've got to get the CAFM system in, or the IWMS system into the GIS system? That's not going to happen. What we really like is for it to be a partnership like this. And again, I think it comes down to the internal champion and the business partner or consultant to be able to help do the translation. So you can go from A to this symbol in your partnership. Do you know what that symbol means? No, he's just, okay. I don't either. All right, so some of the cool stuff that we did. Let me do a sanity check on my time. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay, thank you. So we did mobile devices for this healthcare. We connected to Revit. We did a census tool. We did mail stop signage and integrating with other data systems. One of the things I'd like to emphasize is that one of the things that this champion at this healthcare system did is he always asks who else can benefit from the accuracy of the data that I've got and the space information that I've got. And he's constantly pushing the envelope by saying, I've got data that I think that you can use. And that brings them into the fold. It gets some funding, it gets some interest, it allows them to take it to the next level. That's how we were able to accomplish a lot of these things. So we have what's called a MicroView tablet that allows individuals within the organization to walk floors and to audit rooms. It'll look something like this. So you can take a look over here on the left-hand side. What happens is the floor plan comes up. You touch with your finger the floor. The information will show up over here, and you can edit the information, either add, subtract, modify, and stores it into a storage file for it to be reviewed by the admin to take it into inventory. So we personally, RSC personally does not like the tablet users to take it directly into inventory. We can't have a staging table that you can review. We have an automation process that will, if that's what you'd like, but we like to keep the tablet kind of at a place where you can send a junior individual out and collect data, and then you could review it prior to putting it in. Does that make sense?
I like the terminology.
Yeah. I was going in a non-political correct way, but yes, the junior individual. And you can do, and so for example, this one up here is the room information. This one down here is the employee information. Again, and you just walk the floors. And oftentimes we'll walk floor. We charge $300 a floor to walk floors with our tablets with our staff. If you've got an ARCHIBUS installation, we'll true up your employees and your locations. We have 10 categories. Occupied, not occupied, used for storage, used for server room, locked, demoed, reconfigured, doesn't exist, and we have another one. But anyways, and we just pick one of those, because oftentimes we'll get through this and they'll go, well, what do you mean 35 of these rooms were locked? And I go, well, they were locked, right? We couldn't get in, right? Or it doesn't exist. You thought it was there. It's on your AutoCAD drawing, but you haven't trued this up in a while, right? We do connect with Revit, and ARCHIBUS is bidirectional and live at this health center. Now this is a 2-dimension, but you can see that it is in fact Revit, and these are their some of their floor plans, and so it's a bidirectional connection live with ARCHIBUS, and this is a 3-dimensional Revit model. Census, and this is one of the tools that RSC's developed. Basically what we do is you can send an email out to a certain select set of staff and ask them, is this where you sit? Because this is where we think you sit. And it shows them on a floor plan. And if they go yes, they're done. And if they go no, they're presented with a set of, which building, which floor, which room do you sit in? Touch, touch, touch. Submits back, and then you can take that into inventory. So this is what it looks like. This is the list of individuals that were selected for the survey. So this is a brand new survey. They haven't been surveyed before. This is the census, name of the census that we're doing. We usually go date and information like that. And then how many people are we going out to? How many responded? How many have an application error, as in they're either not the right email, they don't have an email address or something like that. And then the survey goes out, and this is, when they hit the hyperlink in their email, this is what they're presented with. We think you sit here. Is that correct? Yes, this is where I sit. No, this is not where I sit, right? And if it's not where they sit, they can go in and put in information and update and submit the form. We have a mail stop project as well. So in other words, we're helping the delivery individuals know where people's slots are for their mail. And we allow them to define their mail stops in a way that puts their information in so that the mail delivery guys can actually find the mail slot for the individual they're supposed to go to. And the signage project. And so all the signs that are in the university are also digitized and photographed, brought into the system, and identified location and actually the verbiage that's on the sign. And so if anybody makes a change, to a department name or to a cost center name or a location name, they can go in and find out what signs by doing a search. Like I need to find out where the IT department is that needs to have their signage changed because we moved them. So you can find all the signs that will affect. You can then come up with a price for what it takes to get that done. Here's a visual of where all these signs are, what types of signs they are, whether they're informational, directional, freestanding, exterior entrance, all that kind of good stuff. And we have a geographical drill down of all buildings and floors for that, so you can see that. So data integration, again, I've talked about integration before, but we've integrated with multiple synchronizations, including the university. Again, I said the healthcare and the university are separate, so we actually bring some of our chargeback information back to the university for them to go out and get federal funding, but not just for the healthcare, but also for the lab use at the university. And so we will synchronize between multiple databases, and ultimately this comes up with some information that can be shared across multiple entities. These are the locations of all of their facilities in the Bay Area. This is my contact information. Any questions? What did I not cover? And did I do it in time? I got 4 more minutes. Yes, sure.
So, plug integration into Revit, plug it with ARCHIBUS as a plugin.
It's part of the core application. Yeah, it's not. So what do you mean? Define plugin for me.
Well, plug in or add in as far as the integration.
Yeah, it's not a third-party app. It's actually an ARCHIBUS-built application that you can purchase as an additional module.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's an add-in.
Yeah, I get it.
For the buyer.
Oh, yes. Yeah, good question. So it's like AutoCAD as well as Revit. In other words, when you bring up Revit, you're going to see a bunch of ARCHIBUS menus. And when you come into ARCHIBUS, you can then, on the Smart Client, you can click the Revit model, and it will show up inside of the ARCHIBUS. Just by direct.
You have a graphical interface.
Yes, it's actually it's actually Revit. So the graphical interface in ARCHIBUS is Revit. They literally just bring it in.
And then you talked about the census management. Is that a ARCHIBUS module?
No.
Or is that in Revit?
It's the Census that I was showing. That's an RSC build. It's my company. We built it probably 15 years ago to do Census, and so it's a customization or tailor from RSC. Inside of ARCHIBUS, yes. Yes. The 40-40-20? Yes, I can. That one.
Yeah, that one. So, with the sustainable company that you were talking about, did they do this successfully? And about how much time should they have applied in, months to each one of these?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it as quickly as I can in 2 ways, possibly 3. So because I'm in Silicon Valley, I have a lot of high-tech clients. And high-tech clients accept this answer really well. Non-high-tech clients don't like this answer very well. I basically look at my high-tech clients and say, I'm the professional, hand me your drawings, and get out of my way. And I can implement, we've implemented a work order system in 2 weeks for one of my high-tech clients. Literally 2 weeks. We gave them the templates. They filled them out. From the time they gave us the templates back to the time they went live, 2 weeks. But that's because they got out of our way. Traditionally, it takes anywhere from 3 months to 9 months, and sometimes longer depending on the involvement. So the other way I'm going to answer that is, the more people that are in the meeting, the longer it's going to take. And that's not wrong, because oftentimes what you're trying to do is create a culture or a tribe or a cause. And that takes time, right? I'll give you some stories in Silicon Graphics early on when we were doing lease management module. We had like 8 people in the room. 8, yeah, only 8. I handed them my standard for naming leases. That's all it was. Just, here's how you name a lease. This is how I recommend you name a lease. 3 hours later, about 15 iterations, they came right back to the recommendation. And all I had to do was sit back and listen. And it was a big learning experience for me. It's like, look, they needed to buy in. And I will spend that 3 hours anytime I need for people to buy in. Because if they don't buy in, You're going to get disparate understandings. You're going to get sometimes not buy-in and maybe even some sabotage because they don't fully understand. And so taking that time is important to some. Now, the high-tech companies are moving so quickly for me, I can go get on my way, I'm an expert. Brick and mortars, universities, healthcare, we need to take that time because they need to get consensus. Great question. Anything else? I think that's it.
Yep, we're out of time. Bob, I'm sure will be around if
I will be.
anybody has any other questions or anything like that. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.